Jolly good. Okay. Great. Well, apologies everyone for that slight delay. I have a few technical problems, but hopefully you can hear and see us now. And welcome to this, the part of the Temple Bar Trust City Makers series. I'm Peter Murray, I'm chairman of the Temple Bar Trust. And for those of you who haven't been to one of these events before, I'll just tell you a little bit of the background. The Temple Bar Trust was hoping at the start of the pandemic to actually take over Temple Bar as a place to hold lectures, events and tours. But of course, the pandemic stopped all that. And so we are carrying out a series of virtual events to show that we're still actually operating, but hopefully it won't be too long before we can actually get the key to the door to Temple Bar and start doing these things physically. But for the time being, we're virtual, and I'm very pleased to welcome tonight Eric Parry, who's going to talk about new civic spaces and argue for the need for more proactive planning policies. Now, Eric studied at Newcastle, where I remember meeting him in a route master bus a long time ago. Then he went to the Royal College of Art and the Architecture Association. He started Eric Parry Architects in 1983, taught at Cambridge. 2006, he was elected as a Royal Academician, and he's maintained an influential academic reputation while running a successful practice, delivering cultural, educational as well as major commercial projects. And he's also, of course, designed what will be at some stage the tallest building in the centre of the eastern cluster of the City of London. And interestingly, he has a number of livery companies among his clients, including, of course, the leather sellers, for whom he designed a wonderful new hall. So talking about proactive planning seems very relevant at a time when we're debating national design codes, the ravages of permitted development, building beautifully, as well as the destruction caused by COVID-19. So this is a very timely intervention. And this City Maker series is curated by Lucy Bullivant and explores a range of aspects of city planning, architecture and placemaking by key architects who are working in the City of London, as well as historians engaged with its varied and dramatic stresses and strains. So Eric, I look forward to your talk. So over to you.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for that introduction and the reminder of how long we've known each other. And that's a huge pleasure. So I will, without further ado, get into this. I suppose the polemic is actually one about, on the one hand, openness and accessibility, both in a literal sense and in a planning sense. And as Peter said, a kind of thinking about how we as a society and through planning can adopt a more proactive way of introducing, civic institutions, both formal and informal, into the thinking of creating new civic spaces. So on the first part of openness, I wanted just to talk about the strange paradox that exists at the moment, where through the Arts and Heritage Lottery funding system, for huge benefit, one is able to go and access for free most museums. And that's very different from the continental kind of sense of access. But on the other hand, some of our greatest buildings being cathedrals, if you're not a member of the congregation, you have to pay for. And it's just this sort of sense of actually not underestimating the power of that access to culture and the visual arts particularly. And I mean, on a personal note, being in my kind of teenage years growing up in Liverpool, you know, access to somewhere like the Walker Art Gallery was a phenomenal spur and lives on in my mind. So, you know, at that early time in the 60s, you know, to come across wonderful paintings. This is Stubbs. You know, on the one hand was amazing. And then, if I could have the next, please. At the same time in the Walker Art Gallery, I came across the exhibition that was held every 2 years to celebrate the winners of and the shortlisted paintings of the John Moores Prize. And I still have a catalogue from '69 where there were joint winners, Richard Hamilton with his toaster, and then the next, please, Mary Martin's cross, preceded 2 years before that, I remember, by David Hockney as the winner, and then 2 years after, in '71, Ewan Uglow's Nude with 12 vertical positions. These were incredibly important wake-up calls to, you know, the contemporary world. And I have to say that those artists involved, meeting, for one reason or another, you know, artists like Jeremy Moon, have been, for me, an incredible springboard. And I still cherish the catalogue from the John Moores all that time ago. All about being able to wander into a context and enjoy the huge privilege it is that museums and galleries offer. So in terms of our own work, just 2 examples next, please, of projects that have been about that sense of enabling access, where we are, in a spatial sense, creating or helping to create the access that a client will want. St. Martin in the Fields, with its renewal and organization that is so much about how you approach the building in different ways, whether you're homeless, whether you are wanting to get into you know, a meal in the crypt, or to go to an occasion in the rooms there, or indeed to the liturgy in the church. And there it is. The most incredible kind of subtitle to the project was that, you know, it's the Church of the Ever Open Door. Is absolutely fundamental, that sense of access, and in planning terms, access, literally, as well as clarity. Next, please. At a much smaller scale, but very significant, was, you know, the first time that the Charter House had opened its doors in a project called Revealing the Charter House. On the left-hand side, the condition before, with the brothers' bedrooms in this place, then replaced in another building, but opening this up for the first time as a museum, as a learning centre for children, working with the Museum of London, to reveal as a living place of history, as well as dwelling now and through all the centuries back to its Carthusian foundation. Again, the sense of openness being absolutely key. As a thank you. As a in my early days of teaching, this project came to light, and it's the Broadgate project. You know, a revolutionary project in terms of the city and post Big Bang provision of space at a very large scale, enabled by Rose Stanhope and by Arab associates, Philip Dowson, Peter Foggo particularly. I remember bringing students down to have get an understanding, a taste for the incredible scale of this while it was developing, and for Peter Foggo to take us through some of the extraordinary events that led to its formal composition. They had, Philip Dowson had led with the developers a tour of European cities. So they were thinking about city space and proportions. You can see the Finsbury Avenue Square above the circle, and it has always amazed me. Peter was very forthright describing the struggles they had as architects on this. But there's an amazing moment when they are tossing ideas around, thinking about, for instance, the circle, an ice rink, and they put that forward, thinking of the Rockefeller Center. It's tossed back by the developers as being on the verge of insanity. And then Margaret Thatcher arrives to turn the first sod. And somebody whispered in her ear, there's going to be an ice skating rink here. And the next day in Hansard, that was cemented, and the developers were on the phone to Arup Associates to insist there would be an ice rink. So this circle, the circular form, and the formalism of this are a bizarre mix of, you know, of the capitalist kind of urge and private development, and she celebrated that, of course, in Parliament. And it's amazing that that the energy and actually the risks that were being taken. On the other hand, all the buildings at that time were resolutely not accessible. The ground floor was made of entrances, and on the other hand, the ground floor rooms behind the facade were generally post rooms and secondary rooms. So actually one was wandering, and the retail was segregated into the surround at the circle, very beautifully made. You know, there's an extraordinary art program, which you know, I think has been an amazing offering to the city. But my point is that this is city making on a formalist basis, and not on really a civic basis, though it's now changing, of course, in its current ownership. It's got much more accessible, but the institutions remain resolutely banking and finance. Next, please. Working on that scheme were some of the architects who are left to form their own practices, and New Street Square was one of the formal clones, if you will, of Broadgate. Again, some amenity, but again, no civic implication of amenity in the project. It's a beautifully conceived, formally conceived project around a square that is lying off New Fetter Lane. It's a place of calm, well proportioned, good buildings, but questionable in terms of its civic nature. Next, please. So yeah, we come to Temple Bar and this extraordinary arch. The gateways to the city tended to be have a habitable gatekeeper in them. One thinks of Chaucer at Aldgate, and here this beautiful transparency of the fenestration at the center of this entrance to the city from the west on Fleet Street, incredibly important. In the widening of Fleet Street, necessitated by heavy traffic, it was destined to be erected at Theobald's Park. Very interesting how easily stone can be dismantled and put together. So there it is, and then it arrives back. Next, please. In ultimately Paternoster. Paternoster Square and the making of it was a saga that Peter has collated, written about, so it's accessible. But again, in terms of this question of openness, it's very interesting to look at the mindset of architects who were involved in the alternatives for its making. This is the Richard Rogers Partnership at the time scheme, which is a kind of celebration of circulation. You were coming out of St. Paul's tube station with an amazing view of St. Paul's, interrupted only by the chapter house. And I'm sure there were lots of conversations about how that might be dealt with. And then behind that, a kind of mega structure of a ground scraper with a nod to the old Paternoster Row. So an interesting idea about kind of putting St. Paul's into a very telescopic view of emerging from the underground subterranean into the light of a space that is elegantly made around the north of the building. Next, please. Very alternative version a few years later, 3 I think or so, Sauerbruch Hutton's idea of transforming the Holford scheme that was pretty desolate. I mean, this is an interesting scheme in that it had a raised piazza, and in raising it diminished the cathedral. So a real negative there. It closed off the north transept from the Newgate Street on the north, creating kind of letterbox, and was an idea that was kind of current also of adaptation and kind of humanizing the modern movement's tradition of separated slab blocks as city making, and more of that a bit later. Next, please. And just interesting to reflect on, you know, the surrounding and the way that the cathedral has in its context of London changed over time. It always had a communicative aspect, particularly that northeastern flank, where there was an external meeting space. So it had a kind of civic duty as well as a liturgical one. Obviously the chapter house of the old cathedral and its setting and its dense setting right through, next please, to the destruction of the surrounding urban grain. Next. So many others. You know, I hesitate to spend too long on this, but you'll see that second row right hand is the Sir William Holford plan, with what I have just described, the forlorn space, as I remember it, as a piazza with a newsagent and little else. Then we have Foster Associates with a kind of repetitive campus of buildings and no chapter house. We've got SOM with what are larger plate American floor plate buildings that are conceived. Arab Associates with a very fragmented set of buildings that are connected with a mall, and on, all very formalist kind of ideas of a larger or smaller scale urban block. Very much a question in the air, with people like Leon Creer arguing heavily with his brother about what an appropriate block size is in terms of its urban context. Next, please. And then we come to William Whitfield, a rather unsung architect who didn't really crave the limelight very much, was brought in as a kind of trusted party. And I think there was a certain brilliance about his conception. It's in a way picturesque, but it is the square, all based on the idea of vehicular service delivery, which you can just see tucked in the building on the top left, which would run down into the basement, which it indeed does, circulating around the phoenix-like column that is at the center of Paternoster Square, in order to service all the buildings separately, and indeed service the cathedral and the Mason's Yard, circulating around the chapter house. And he conceived of a kind of spiral of scale, moving from the chapter house up eastwards, and then dealing with St. Paul's Heights. And he created the outlines of these buildings, which led to some heated debates with architects who came before I got a call to ask whether I could help with the building that is illustrated in plan in more detail. To the left is the Richard Mccormack building, and this is the building that now houses the stock exchange. It was, like the other offices, a speculative office at the time. And you can see I had an idea of an internal passage, which does exist, though they have, for whatever reason, closed the northern access from Newgate. I'm not going into detail with this building, but what William Whitfield did cleverly was to work with the cathedral and the idea of this spiral of scale to accommodate the densities that were being requested of him. There was always a pressure to reduce the public domain, and he had another idea above ground, which was to create an arcading or a kind of structuring of the space, particularly to the north, of a permanence that would allow the buildings behind to come and go over time. So in so doing, enshrining the public realm of this private estate. So that was some of the ideas. The other was the creation of this very tense passage between the buildings on the north in order to open up the vista to the North Transept. And the other part of this, which is incredibly well judged, is the scaling of the loggia, which has a 6-meter bay on the ground, and then a 9-meter height, which means that whilst you're in that loggia, you frame the entire cathedral right to the cross on top of the dome in a very elegant way. So here was I felt over time, we had our disagreements, partly because I wanted to drive the building that we were given, which had an odd geometry of St. Paul's Heights running through it, which meant on one side it was 5 stories, the other 6 stories. I wanted to take it to the ground, which he resisted. Next, please. So his precedents, and he had many, one of which he quoted was always Livorno, and the arcading to the city space, which had allowed a kind of had given an order to the definition of the space behind which, kind of echoing obviously at the center, the very civic use of the cathedral, the buildings that create that flanking discipline. Next, please. So this is it as built out, and you can just see his arcade and very clear colonnade, I should say. Very clearly, you can see that spiral at work in terms of the scaling. Next, please. And of course, he was, as we'll come to see, you know, he was part of the accommodation of indeed Temple Bar itself. So this was my my attempt to bring the loggia, which had a kind of within the scaling of the building, a way of coming to the square, which we had. We didn't come to blows, but we had pretty strong kind of opinions about. I had to bow in the end to his judgment. Next, please. And this was the idea between that 5 and 6 stories, the left-hand side being the passage, Next, please. So this is the 6th story to the left. His colonnade and the loggia of the center of the building coming through and resting upon it. Next, please. And this is that very well judged, very tight view. It's only 5.5 meters or so wide, 5 stories high, but it sure concentrates very beautifully the focus on the north transept, which had been hidden in the Holford plan. Next, please. So obviously the makeup of that square is the stock exchange exhibits itself a little bit in certain ways, and had a television broadcasting set of studios in it, which meant that it was part of a media world. But the chapter house is not open to the public. It is essentially a city square with little civic use to it. The next project I am going to refer to, I should say, is the extraordinary and very fertile world of Birmingham on the left-hand side, late 18th century, showing the introduction of the canals and basins for turnabouts and so on, creeping in towards the growing city. And on the right, a 19th century plan around the 30s, which you can see in both St. Paul's, which is upper left and is part of the jewellery quarter, of course, and the cathedral and the openness around the cathedral, which is the focus then in the early 20th century plan, which I hope comes next. That shows the extraordinary explosion of infrastructure with the railways, the stations, and the density, so that the cathedral has a set of blocks in front of it, and then there are the very powerful Edwardian and Victorian buildings of the council house, the art gallery, very early, wonderful art school, arts and crafts building right behind that. And the museum and art gallery. Then the library, the town hall, which is an extraordinary building, and a dense fabric of streets and vistas. Next, please. Gets blown away, just like so many of these cities, by highway engineering. And in the world of attempted separation, so you've got this incredible infrastructure. Birmingham always very adventurous, I would say, in their urban planning. You get that dotted line, and then just in grey, you can see the library, a building that could easily have been listed as a brutalist icon, but in this instance, it serves in its joining to the gallery to break the roots that existed in visual terms, certainly from Victoria Square running up by the flank of those Edwardian buildings. And then on the other side, separating it from the War Memorial and the spaces that are built over the railway tunnel that runs under that point. So, incredible infrastructure here and ambition. Next, please. That leads to the Glen Howell master plan, which conceived as in conjunction with the city to demolish the library, to build a new library, which they have done, which is a roaring success, and to create the bridging over that infrastructure. There's another road that's spinning through, and you can see what was a competition that we won for the first building in the development, One Paradise. Next, please. So the figure ground of this, if this were a drawing of that, it's begun here. You get the sort of sense in those public buildings of the town hall, a great public venue, massive organ, and I'm sure many people have been to it to witness concerts and so on in it. On the other side, so that very much an accessible civic part of the jigsaw, the museums there and the library, all contributing. But the buildings, mainly for the master plan, being commercial with a sprinkling of retail at the ground. So this building, next please, just very briefly, sits as a building that you come to from Victoria Square, which was actually an extraordinary public realm project in its own right back in the 80s. Past here, flanking left, the town hall, right, the Edwardian council chambers, and then the new building raised in order to allow the infrastructure to work around it with the retail, but an entrance into what is primarily an office building. Next, please. So these two images, just a part of the materiality of that, is a kind of echo of the wonderful Anglesey limestone called the marble on the town hall. Next, please. But I wanted just to take us right back to, and there's another more academic version of this, which would seek to look at different strategies for civic design and urban and towns and city making that go back to the studios of various schools of architecture. But cutting that tonight, I wanted to nonetheless turn to the city structures of the world, the Hellenistic world. First, Miletus, to look at some of the civic uses that archaeologists tell us were part of the makeup, next please, of this bit of that former plan with the agora, the Bouleuterion number 7, which is equivalent to the Senate house, or the council chamber, so to speak. Praetorion, which is the civic dining space, a kind of formal dining space that existed in many of these city structures, as well as other civic uses that are drawn together in a very beautiful way, often in a way that back in the sort of from the 6th century on BC, starts to have a massive impact on European city planning, certainly from the 18th century on. Next, please. And obviously, this is the remains of that wonderful space with the heroon that is in an atrium as you come into it, always a reminder of foundation. And then next, please, into the echoes that we find in the US Senate, and indeed, for instance, the next, please, the Reichstag is still in use in this arcuated form. Next, please. And as ideal, following Michel Foucault and others, the world of mind and madness, of sanity and madness, is never far removed. Here, this extraordinary and wonderful complex is a kind of idealized city, civic space, the Asclepion at Pergamon, which is actually effectively a place of well-being. It's conceived of in the way of rehabilitation and dealing with madness. It's related to the city along the ceremonial way to the right. You come in and you have all the constituent parts, the theatre, you have the temple, you have a library, you have the stoa, you have the rooms of residence, and you have what is believed to be dream incubation spaces that are approached from a subterranean position, all surrounded on the one side by a sacred wood and looking back to the everyday of the city to one side, so on elevated ground, separated but related and mirroring. Next, please. And those kind of idealized worlds between the city and the country take many shapes and forms. And in the English tradition, there are these town-like organizations with very clear, in the 19th century certainly, association with biophilia and the restorative power of nature, of gardening, and many interesting texts to many of these. Next, please. As opposed to a project like this of rabid formalist character, the unbuilt perspective by the architect Pouillet in Paris of a multi-leveled asylum at the same time as Bentham's Panopticon, with service and wards separated as prison-like an edifice as you could imagine, with a heroon at the center that celebrates that disastrous vision. Next, please. That takes the predictable form of courts. It's a prison, not a place of recuperation. And just a reminder of what architecture can represent. Next, please. So in urban terms, you get to something like Trafalgar Square, and this A to Z map that kind of suggests the roundabout that it was. Next, please. Just where it came from. I'm in awe and admiration of Nash as a landscape designer, and you know, in many ways, many of his ideas are incredibly ambitious. Look at this one. This is the creation of Trafalgar Square with the Royal Academy of Arts proposed at the centre to separate the statues of George III and IV, who famously didn't get on with each other, and the changing of creation of a new building for the National Gallery of Art out of the William Kent stables, because this is all happening in the Royal Mews, and that for the first time proposes with the inflection, the opening up of St. Martin the Fields as a civic building, a parish church elevated, and obviously here it is, the origins of Trafalgar Square. Next, please. And just off it, these three show what the outcome of that was in terms of the first amazing Gibbs church as a white Portland stone temple in the middle of medieval fabric, Nash's scheme that opens it up with that beautiful site of it, and then on to what we did to curtail aspects, open up the public realm, and so on. Next, please. And at the same time, but earlier, happening World Square's, Norman Foster's extraordinary and very successful scheme to take the gyratory away. It's been echoed in many schemes since. Next, please. That just gives that north-facing, northern flank, as it were, to the square, and what a gift, given that it was a road that was so dangerous to pass, as Norman Foster's notes describe. Next, please. Yeah, and so I think that the makeup of Trafalgar Square is extraordinary. Chance encounters, but you know, those very civic buildings that are conceived as part of making public space. And here at King's Cross, that went through a set of first of all the proposal there was a kind of racetrack proposal with a landscape centre to the Argent proposal. Next, please. Which is seen here in its principle of residential to one side and the commercial around the station, with what has now become the Google headquarters, the long wedged building on the left-hand side. Obviously, infrastructure at a massive scale. But the great thing with this was the chance encounter that materialized into a wonderful proposition to turn the Townsend yards, warehousing, a wonderful section, into the art school. So becoming the University of the Arts HQ was massive socially for this scheme. And then following on with one of the plots, the commercial plots, becoming Camden's HQ, it started to take on a social and civic attitude and I would say character, even though it is by far more a private estate developed with very strong public leanings, in terms of the negotiations that went on, that started way back, so in the early 2000s, really, with charrette, next please, of architects unknowing of what their neighbors might be. So this was a proposition for that wedge building with a view to the gas holders on the one side, a favorite for architecture students in architecture schools. On the right-hand side, that glimpse of the Townsend in a wedge-shaped building defined by the master planners with their clever balance of commercial need. Again, this is a great scheme in terms of the way the buildings are serviced to relieve and create the public amenity and access of the space that is rising. Next, please, and the built version of that, with this building of ours being the last piece in the jigsaw. Next, please. And so it is to my thank you for your forbearance, but here it is to my last project, which starts, I think, to hint at what I'm describing and promulgating in terms of civic participation in the making of urban space, rather than a lassitude, as it were, leaving it to essentially private enterprise with the intervention of planning regulation, rather than that planning being the catalyst for civic space. But a wonderful plan in my mind that was we produced as part of the work on the Charter House, actually, just looking at the religious institutions, and you get to the Charter House, that beautiful square conceived by the wonderful architect Henry Yeaverly in the 14th century. But the project we're going to look at is just on the west side of the Fleet, where the Whitefriars became based, very close to the river at that point. Next, please. So this area to the west of the Fleet and Ludgate has obviously changed over time, but it has enormously deep roots. But its relationship essentially to the world of the judiciary is very strong. So this plan, which is probably a little too small to see, just illustrates those proximities. The site is the site on Fleet Street, the wedge that is in red, not that far from the Royal Courts of Justice, as the next slide I think illustrates well. That you have this radius that picks up the Old Bailey on the one hand, other law courts, and the Royal Courts of Justice and the Temple And amazingly serviced by all the underground bus routes. And you can see the processional route in the blue dots running from west to east. Next, please. So this is the site, Fleet Street. On the left is a street called Whitefriars Street, which tells of that connectivity. Tudor Street lies on the axis running west to east, but west into the Inns of Temple, Inner Temple, and to the right of the site is St. Bride's Church. Next, please. So what you have is at the moment a site that is made up of the cruciform insect-like building from the early 70s called Fleet Bank House that bounds the west side of a square called Salisbury Square that is entered, and is a very historic square, entered from Fleet Street by Salisbury Court and then by Dorset Rise to the south. And a number of buildings on Fleet Street. Next, please. Our brief for the competition was to create a building to house 18 new courts, 8 of which would be Crown Courts, and so a court building, a major new building that would reflect the changing face of crime in the city, cybercrime, and would reflect also then a site that could accommodate the City of London Police Force, the HQ for them, and to then provide with what bit was left, some commercial, because the city has dug deep into its pockets to create the Law Court building as it does the Old Bailey, and to lease it to HMCTS, so Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service, who will have run the building, which will be offered to them, so to speak, for 125 years. And that's the same lease length for the police station. So police building, I should say. This is the view at the competition stage of the building on Fleet Street, naturally quite large, and its relationship to St. Paul's. Next, please. So this is the sense back then of working to an envelope that would allow the centre to be taller than the flanks to north and south, to develop into a scheme with 3 buildings. Next, please. That has come to the point now of a planning application where to the north you will see the court building with the inflected wings to Fleet Street, with the public to emphasize the public entrance at the center, punching through on through the building to a staircase that rises through 3 critical floors, and creates passages, new passages that don't exist, just to the south of the court building and to the south of the police building. 2 new passages, an expansion of the square, the use of a listed building from the late 19th century to turn that into an amenity, will be refashioned internally as a public house, and showing next to it the Lutyens building, which is a building that he designed for Reuters and the Associated Press, which had in it, which was evident in the urban fabric before, a passage that is centered on the entrance to St. Bride's, a wonderful church, so that we are drawing that passage into the square more evidently than it has been before, and therefore drawing St. Bride's as well into the picture of the new civic space. Incredibly important, the sacred dimension that exists along with the secular and with the uses of the buildings together. In the middle is the police building, And one of the points about that is that it has to, underneath this is, you can imagine, a complex world of traffic. The police have a force of vehicles that come out of the building on a ramp to Whitefriars Street. The green area in the police building, it marks, as you will know when you walk around stations in London, the need for natural daylight into cells beneath. And then on, so the police effectively building takes frontal onto the square, and the commercial building is to the south, which I'll come on to in a minute. Next, please. So these are the three buildings. The new passage, you can see, links very interestingly the listed building, the Lutyens building, the spire of St. Bride's, St. Paul's Cathedral in the background, and beyond that, the great raking of the buildings to allow the dome to have its space in the horizon. The three buildings are not designed as a campus. They're designed to reflect their use and their position. So the court building is in a limestone, reflecting the civic buildings of London, the police in an external structure of weathering steel, and the commercial building in terracotta. Those two buildings sharing a kind of hue, a palette, and the fact that the unglazed terracotta, is absorbent as the weathering steel is. Next, please. This was an early sketch of that passage with the consultation rooms set in a stack of oriels that reflect the court use, the public access and public passage into the courts being on the south side, with that staircase that rises not the entire height of the building, but to encompass the Crown Courts on the first and third floor, with the police building to the right. Next, please. Just generically, this is the form. This is called, is born out of the brief for Courts of the Future, a very interesting set of improvements to court hearing rooms, which are at the heart of the court building. Of course, you can see the public passage and consultation spaces on the southern side. The cores that on each floor relate to two hearing rooms on the east and two hearing rooms on the west, and then the managed circulation of judiciary and witnesses to the north, allowing always light into the court hearing spaces. Next, please. So this is the section, Fleet Street to the left, the passage through that staircase that then dives into the building with the smaller hearing rooms of magistrates and civil courts on the upper levels, and then the judiciary on top with access to the gardens on top. Next, please. And one of the development of the facade, the limestone facade, deep recesses, a loggia that pulls forward. The flanks inflect to give more space to the sky than the competition sketch you saw, and then the top is set back in this faceted exedral form with drawers with top light on the back of it from the street to release the pressure. Next, please. So this is an early sketch of that. The inflected wings give a surprising amount of space around, for instance, St. Dunstan's looking westwards. Next, please. And this is the view looking eastwards, again with the inflection showing the more of the Lutyens building as one moves down Fleet Street. Next, please. Looking up, and next, some very wonderful neighbors like the Daily Express buildings. Next, please. So this is the master plan, working with Christopher Bradley Hole and his team on the urban greening and public realm. You can see how we begin to connect into the mature landscape around St. Bride's, and indeed on the left-hand side, the wonderful gardens of the Inner Temple. Next, please. And the CGIs of that passage, with the palimpsest of the listed building, Lutyens and Wren. Next, please. And the police building as it comes to the square. 1,000 people in this building, and a front desk for the public as well, very much so. Next, please. So this gives you the envelope and the section through the three buildings and the connected landscape underneath, commercial buildings lying separately. Next, please. And this is the view with working with Richard Griffiths on the listed building, where he has created a new southern-facing aspect for that public house. And we've moved a wonderful listed obelisk to Watham, great philanthropist, onto the axis of the, as a proposition, onto the axis of the southern passage. But this shows the three buildings and the listed building coming together in a square, which with St. Bride's just off it, is going to be a place whenever you go past the Royal Courts of Justice, you often see the paparazzi. This is a place for debate. This is a new civic space that is the narrative of which is injustice and law and order, and the secular and the sacred, including, of course, the commercial building. Next, please. So the three buildings once more, and the next. So to the entrance on the corner of the commercial building, the office building, workplace building. Next, please. And looking at it from Whitefriars Street with the new passage, you can just see the obelisk online. And this will be a bike hub, retail and cafe with parking for bikes just off the highway, of course, and repair facilities. Next, please. And its southernmost neighbour is a rather wonderful listed pub called the Harrow. So we create a much better condition. I'm not showing you the existing at this point. And this is the entrance up Whitefriars Street for the wagons that are coming in and out to both the police and the courts, with the need, the security need at that point for a first pass. Next, please. And looking back, so you can see how the terracotta proposed of rammed terracotta will sit next to the Edwardian and Victorian buildings with their brick and stone on Whitefriars Street at this point. Next, please. So just the public realm, the sense of porosity, sense of use that makes the civic space. Next. And that aerial view. And I think lastly, the next. Yeah, and the next, sorry. Yeah, the views from the judiciary roof on the court. Each of the buildings has a very important aspect of wellness, which is part of the biophilia, and very, very important for a sense of relief with these very intense buildings, along with the new public realm. Next, please. Should be it. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Eric, for a fascinating talk. And that is an amazing civic project you have at Fleet Street, and that's going to make a major change in the city. And it's one which, of course, will go ahead. I think probably Liz Diller feels very envious, because the future of the Centre for Music seems more and more dodgy at the moment, doesn't it? But obviously, police and the law are things that we need to maintain in the city. Now, we are not very far from time, but there is a chance for you to put a question in the chat should anyone wish to ask Eric a question. But perhaps I could just start by, do you actually enjoy that I mean, it's very interesting looking at the site you've got to play with. You're very much stitching things into an existing grain of the city. Is that something you enjoy, or would you actually prefer to have a more of a tabula rasa to deal with in creating the sort of spaces and relationships with buildings that you are designing?
Well, you know, if I'm in a different and more utopian kind of setting, if you will, yeah, it might be possible to create a very different kind of sense of juxtaposition. This is a rare site in the city. It's got conservation areas. It will just happily accept the depth and the width that is required of it for the buildings. So actually, you know, that sense of can Fleet Street, that 73 meters, accommodate the law building, the court building? Yes, it can, 30 meters deep. I think it seems to me that there's a tension there that is kind of you know, wonderful in terms of its density. So I'm very happy actually with the juxtapositions, the tautness of some of those passages, and the narrative that can be derived from them. So you know, thinking of the 5.5 meters that I talked about, William Whitfield defining with that axis to the north transept, the 8 meters with the Orioles that the north passage is judged with taller buildings, you know, to be about the explosive moment when you go down Whitefriars Street and you see this wonderful steeple rising above the fabric. Actually, you need density to create some of those very powerful urban moments, it seems to me. And one only needs to think of, you know, great experiences, turning a corner in Rome, you know, also the sound that definition creates, and indeed the environment, because it's a south-facing space. That pub you come out of into the space, and I think it's going to be really a very kind of quietening space in the city off Fleet Street, but nonetheless with an enormous reverberation around the uses of the buildings that make up its edge. The point being that public space is not just a definition of an edge. It is all about what happens behind it. It's absolutely to do with the uses of the buildings that surround it, and not just the form of the space itself.
Did you have any discussion with the city about actually Fleet Street itself? You've got, it seems quite a red line at the edge of the pavement there, but the frontage of that building is going to be quite a public entrance in itself, is it not? And with there will be events where press are standing outside and so on, as they are further up towards the Strand at the law courts there. Did you get a chance to have a look at how you might address the street itself, or how the street might address the building, rather?
Absolutely, because it's a prominent building on the processional way, as it's called. The inflections create a lot of space at the edges and at the centre. So there is a loggia as well at that centre. So it opens up to the centre. And then as you move through the building, you get the view to the building behind and the passage, and you always get light and orientation. But there is the square itself, which is where I think, you know, the paparazzi, as it were, and the media will congregate, because that is intended, and it's made into a space that has within it an arena for just such events. So, you know, I think that's certainly very much part of the conversation with the city, and one that is also very, very interesting in terms of animation. So there's another whole story that I could spend an hour on about the intentions for that animation.
Right, we haven't got now, but perhaps I just open up a conversation about another building, which you showed a number of perspectives where in the distance there was a tip of one undershaft on the skyline there, and you have public space underneath that as well, which connects into other public spaces in the eastern cluster. I mean, first of all, how does that relate to the conversation we've been having about your approach to urban spaces, but also where is that as a project? Do you think it's on the cards to happen in the near future, or is it uncertain as to what the future holds?
Well, I have every confidence it is, and you know, there's a very viable lease that is there at the moment that will run out, and the time will come for that. But you know, very clearly, I was aiming and got the agreement of the Museum of London for the museum to take the top 2 floors with classrooms. So that was very much part of the top of the building. The base of the building, of course, is absolutely about the joining up of elements, not least the 2 wonderful churches, St Andrew's and St Helens. So you know, that landscape at the base of the building is all about expanding the public realm at that heart of you know, the insurance district. And of course, the other aspect is that if one goes down to Fenchurch Street, then the garden at 120 is all about that negotiation, as the planning permission that's been sealed on the Clothworkers site at 50 Fenchurch Street, a cascade of public space. Public space is absolutely key to any of the pieces in the jigsaw of the square mile. My argument is that it has to be accompanied by more than simply workplace. You know, in terms of activating in a meaningful way the public realm and civic space rather than urban space, if you will.
Yes, because the interesting part about well, the Fenchurch Street building now, of course, fits into a whole network, even going through the Willis building and so on, which are, let's say, modern reinventions of traditional alleyways, and you get that feeling of going through confined spaces. And I guess that also once one undershaft is completed, you will have a whole network going through Leadenhall building and into that space and through under your building, and then out to the 30 St Mary Axe and maybe even the Tulip at some stage.
Yeah, I think you know, and then there are amazing surprises actually where these different projects come together. So it's not just one orientation. It seems to me that in that way that planning has been so important to maintain those passages and the weave of those through the city fabric, that as it takes shape, you know, that there are extraordinary juxtapositions which are born out of the picturesque idea of landscape defining the topography of the eastern cluster, as it's called.
And my last question, because we should let people go because it's we are a bit over time, is I felt you were a little bit unfair about Broadgate. You suggested it was a bit closed off, and certainly the buildings at ground floor were closed off. They were closed off because it was thought at the time that it was bad to have a retail lease in the same buildings as office lease. I mean, there were other drivers that actually made that decision, but actually the planning of Broadgate was you know, based originally on a layout with space syntax, which actually connected it into the local area and did tie it in well, which has set it in good stead now as attitudes to leases change, that you can actually put retail at ground level on offices, that it is working now, providing a quite flexible master plan, which actually has suited very different sorts of attitudes to leases and commercial arrangements, which is now being, I think the story is being told that it was very closed off when it was originally designed. I don't think that's quite true.
I think if I rang a critical note, it was not on the formal planning of it and the way it's integrated into the streets at all. I think, as I say, it was a torchbearer of development. So I am not being critical of its formal characteristics, but I am in terms of the ambition for animation, for social engagement with the buildings that has changed and got much better, but as you say, was in the first instance totally defensive. So it is in part of my thesis, as it were, is that in planning, there are the chance encounters that have happened on the Argent development at King's Cross, which have been phenomenal. It seems to me that at the same time these things are being discussed in formal terms, there is the possibility of injecting into urban planning a kind of sense of necessity for political spaces, spaces of debate, spaces of engagement, which in Noli terms would be a way of expanding the public realm meaningfully into adjoining buildings that define the space. So I hope I'm very clear on that, and not trying to pull the rug on what was, I think I said, a monumental and incredibly ambitious scheme.
Yes, absolutely. We owe a lot to Peter Foggo, and because he even created a public space in Stockley Park, of course, where you also worked. No,
I mean, and I have nothing, nothing but admiration for Peter Foggo, his team, Rab and his team at New Street Square. I think these are great responses to tough briefs to provide the quantum of space that is required.
Super. Well, thank you very much, Eric, for, as usual, a splendid lecture. And I mean, it used to be said that Richard Seifert built more buildings in the City of London than Christopher Wren, or had more impact on the City of London than Christopher Wren. And then it was Norman Foster for a bit. But I think now with this Fleet Street project and one undershaft, you're going to take that title fairly soon. So Eric, thank you very much indeed for talking to us this evening, and thank you everybody for joining us.